My name is Carlos Mendez. I am 43 years old. And today, as I write this sitting at the kitchen table in my small apartment in Los Angeles, I can still feel the stab in my chest that pierced me a week ago. It's Friday afternoon, 5:15 to be exact. And outside I can hear the constant noise of traffic on Cesar Chavez Avenue. The air conditioner is making that metallic noise that I'm sick of, but I don't have the money to fix it. It smells like refried beans that I heated up in the microwave, and that cheap disinfectant I use to clean the table every night. Sunlight filters through the yellowed curtains I bought at the 99-cent store 3 years ago. I found this fake wood table I'm sitting at on the street one Sunday morning when I was coming home from the night shift at the warehouse. It has coffee stains and scratches, but it's mine. Everything in this place is like that. Used, found, borrowed. Nothing really mine, except the memories I carry and this pain that won't leave my chest. My son Diego called me on the phone last Tuesday. He's 17 now, a senior in high school in Guadalajara. When I answered the phone, as I always do, I spoke to him in Spanish. "How are you, mijo? How's school?" And he answered me in English. Again, "I'm fine, Dad." "School is okay," I said, with that mixture of pride and sadness I always feel when he shows how well he speaks English. "Speak to me in Spanish, Diego. You know I like to hear you speak our language." And then it happened. Diego was silent for a few seconds that felt like hours. I could hear him breathing through the phone, that sound I've known since he was a baby. Finally, he said, in broken Spanish with an American accent, "Dad, I'm embarrassed by your accent when you speak English. My friends, they laugh." I froze. The phone in my hand felt like it weighed 100 pounds. My heart stopped for a moment and then started beating so hard that I thought Diego could hear it from Guadalajara. My voice trembled when I asked him, "What did you say, son?" "Dad, when you call the school or when you talk to my friends' parents, your English sounds different, and I'm embarrassed. That's why I prefer to speak English with you, to practice, so it's not so obvious that we are." He didn't finish the sentence, but I knew what he meant. That we're Mexican, that we come from somewhere else, that we don't belong. I hung up the phone without saying goodbye. I sat here in this same chair where I am now, watching the sun set through the window. Tears burned my eyes. But I didn't cry. Not yet. First, I needed to remember. I needed to understand how we got here. It all started 18 years ago in a small town near Morelia called La Piedad. It was a place where everyone knew each other, where time passed slowly, like the thick honey that Doña Carmen sold at the market on Sundays. I remember the smell of freshly made tortillas coming from my mother's house every morning at 5 o'clock, mixed with the aroma of coffee that my father boiled in an old pewter pot he had inherited from his father. Our house was small, made of adobe and brick, painted sky blue, which peeled away with the July rains. It had 2 rooms, a kitchen that was also a living room, and a backyard where my mother raised chickens that clucked before dawn. The floor was polished cement that my father had laid with his own hands, and at night it felt cold under my bare feet when I got up to pee. My father, Ruben Mendez, was a man with huge, calloused hands that always smelled of motor oil and Delicado cigarettes. He worked in Don Aurelio's mechanic shop, fixing tractors and old trucks that came in from the nearby ranches. He was dark as the earth after rain, with a thick mustache that turned white at the tips. And when he laughed, which was often, deep wrinkles formed around his eyes. His favorite saying was, Son, honest work will never make you rich, but it will always feed you. My mother, Rosa Elena, was thin as a reed, but strong as an oak. Her small, nervous hands were never still, always kneading, sewing, cleaning, combing my unruly hair in the mornings before sending me off to school. She sang as she worked, songs by Pedro Infante that she had learned from her mother, and her sweet voice mingled with the sound of pigeons nesting on the tin roof. When she scolded me, she did so in a soft but firm voice that reached me to the bone. Carlos Alberto. Good children obey their parents and study to be someone in life. I was the oldest of 3 siblings. Next came my sister Lupita, 2 years younger, with long black braids that my mother did every morning, and whose knees were always scraped from playing marbles with the neighborhood kids. The youngest was Javier, who was only 5 when I turned 15, and who followed my father everywhere like a little puppy, carrying tools in a shoebox he had decorated with pictures of the Virgin of Guadalupe. Sundays were sacred in our house. After 8 o'clock Mass at the parish church of San Francisco, the whole family would gather at my paternal grandparents' house for lunch. My grandmother, Esperanza, who was over 70 but cooked like a girl of 20, would prepare mole de olla that smelled heavenly from the moment you walked through the door. My grandfather, Esteban, with his palm hat that he never took off, would tell us stories of the revolution that he had heard from his own father, while we grandchildren sat on the dirt floor listening with our mouths open. The Benito Juarez Elementary School was 8 blocks from my house, a red brick building with a dirt yard where we played soccer with a rag ball we had made together. Teacher Consuelo, an elderly woman with thick glasses and floral dresses that always smelled of mothballs, taught me to read and write with infinite patience. I vividly remember the day I managed to read my first complete sentence. The boy eats bread. My lips moved slowly, pronouncing each syllable, and when I finished, Teacher Consuelo applauded and gave me a tamarind candy she kept in her desk for special occasions. In the afternoons, after doing my homework at the kitchen table under the yellowish light of the bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, I would go out to play with my neighborhood friends. We were a gang of 6 or 7 kids who ran through the dirt streets, chasing chickens, climbing mango trees, hiding in the cornfields that surrounded the town. My best friend was Raul Herrera, a skinny boy with big teeth who always had his pockets full of colored marbles and could whistle louder than anyone else in town. When I turned 13, everything started to change. My body stretched as if someone had pulled me from both ends. My voice cracked like an old plate, and pimples appeared on my face that my mother tried to cure with homemade remedies that smelled of sulfur and herbs. But more than the physical changes, what really marked me was realizing for the first time that we were poor. Not poor as in not having anything to eat, but poor as in counting every penny before spending it. High school was different. I had to walk to the center of town, a 20-minute walk under the sun that, in April and May, seemed to melt even the stones. The building was bigger, with concrete classrooms that heated up like ovens during the day and cooled down like refrigerators at night. The teachers were stricter, especially Mr. Rodriguez, who taught math with a wooden ruler that he didn't hesitate to use to hit the knuckles of distracted students. It was in my 2nd year of high school that I met my first love. Her name was Patricia Morales, but everyone called her Patty. She had waist-length brown hair, dark brown eyes that seemed to hold secrets, and a smile that made me forget how to talk. She sat 2 rows in front of me in history class, and I spent hours watching her hair move when she turned her head to talk to her friends. I wrote her my first love letter on a page torn from my Spanish notebook, my hands shaking with nervous teenage excitement. I told her I liked her, that I thought about her all the time, and asked her if she wanted to be my girlfriend. I passed it to her through her friend Monica during recess one Tuesday in March. My heart was beating so fast that I thought it was going to jump out of my chest while I waited for her answer. The next day, Patty came up to me after gym class. I was sweaty and nervous, wiping my hands on my shirt over and over again. She smiled at me and said, "Yes, I want to be your girlfriend, Carlos. But it has to be a secret because my dad won't let me have a boyfriend until I'm 15. I felt like I had won the lottery and run a marathon at the same time. Our relationship lasted 6 months of secretly holding sweaty hands, exchanging letters during recess, and stealing glances during class. We would meet at the park on Sundays after Mass, walk around the square talking about everything and nothing, sharing corn with chili and lemon that we bought with the coins we had saved up during the week. Our first kiss was on a Sunday in September, under the jacaranda tree behind the church. Her lips tasted like strawberry gum and nerves, and when we parted, we both turned red as tomatoes. After that, every Sunday was an adventure, waiting for that moment when we could be alone, even if only for 5 minutes. But like all teenage love stories, ours ended suddenly and painfully. Patty's father, Don Lucio, found out about our relationship because one of the gossipy neighbors saw him kissing her on the cheek. That same afternoon, Don Lucio came to my house, his face red with anger and his fists clenched. He yelled at my father that I was irresponsible, that I was corrupting his daughter, that the boys in my family had no manners. My father, who had never yelled at anyone in his life, remained silent, listening to the insults. When Don Lucio left, he called me into the backyard. He looked me in the eyes for a long time, with that look he had when he was thinking about something important. Finally, he said, "Son, when a man disrespects you, it's because he thinks he's better than you. And sometimes, the only way to prove him wrong is to be better than him. When I was 16, I had to get my first job. It wasn't because I wanted to, but because the situation at home had become difficult. The workshop where my father worked had lost several customers. The corn harvest had been poor that year due to drought, and my mother had started taking sewing jobs at night to make ends meet. I got a job at Don Miguel's grocery store. He was a fat man with a gray mustache who chewed toothpicks all day and had a habit of counting the money in the cash register 3 times before closing. The store smelled of powdered soap, dried chilies, and the sweet smell of fruit that was starting to ripen too much. I worked Monday through Saturday, from 4 to 8 in the afternoon, for 30 pesos a week. My job was to stock merchandise, sweep the floor, clean the shelves, and help carry heavy purchases for the women in town. Don Miguel was demanding but fair. He taught me how to count change quickly, identify counterfeit bills by holding them up to the light, and treat customers with respect even if they were rude. "The customer is always right," he would tell me, "but that doesn't mean you have to put up with being disrespected." On Saturday nights, after closing the store, Don Miguel would give me my 30 pesos in crumpled bills and coins that smelled like rusty metal. I would walk home with that small fortune in my pocket, feeling important and grown up. I would arrive home and give 20 pesos to my mother for household expenses, keep 5 for my personal expenses, and put the other 5 in a Nescafe coffee can that I hid under my bed. It was my first savings, my first lesson in home economics. With my first full paycheck, I bought a pair of synthetic leather shoes that I had seen in the window of the shoe store downtown. They were black, shiny, with laces that looked like silk. They cost me 25 pesos, almost my entire week's pay. But when I put them on and walked through town, I felt like a different man. The sound they made against the pavement was like music to my ears. During those months working in the store, I learned things I had never been taught in school. I learned that the rich people in town bought the most expensive things without even asking the price, while people like us counted every coin before deciding if we could afford a Coca-Cola. I learned that some customers treated you as if you were invisible, and others talked to you as if you were family. I learned that money wasn't just paper and metal, but freedom and dignity. At 18, fresh out of high school with mediocre grades but eager to take on the world, I met the woman who would change my life forever. Her name was Maria Teresa Jimenez, but everyone called her Tere. She was 2 years younger than me, studying to be a secretary at a business school downtown, and she had a laugh that sounded like church bells on a Sunday morning. I met her at her school's prom. I had gone with my cousin Roberto, who was studying accounting there and had convinced me to accompany him with the promise that there would be lots of pretty girls and free beer. The hall was decorated with colored crepe paper, balloons hanging from the ceiling, and a local band playing cumbias and boleros with more enthusiasm than talent. Tere wore a navy blue dress that matched her eyes and low-heeled shoes that made her walk carefully on the mosaic floor of the hall. Her black hair was pulled back into a bun, with a few strands framing her face. And when she smiled, a dimple appeared on her left cheek that I thought was the most beautiful thing in the world. I asked her to dance with me during a song by Los Angeles Azules, and even though I wasn't a good dancer, she let me lead her patiently. Her hands were soft but firm, and when she put one hand on my shoulder, I could smell her perfume. Something floral and sweet that I later learned was from a cheap brand she bought at the market. But that night, it smelled like the most expensive perfume in the world to me. We talked all night, standing next to the table where they served fruit punch and sweet cookies. She told me that she lived with her parents and 3 younger brothers in a house near the bus station, that her dream was to work in an important office in Morelia, that she liked to read romantic novels that she borrowed from the town library. I told her about my plans to study mechanics, my job at the store, and my dream of owning my own workshop someday. When the dance ended, I walked her home slowly along the cobblestone streets of the town. The moon was full that night, and its silvery light made everything look like a black and white movie. We said goodbye at her door with a handshake that lasted longer than usual and a promise to see each other on Sunday at 11 o'clock Mass. Our courtship lasted 2 years of Sundays in the square. Letters written on scented paper, and her younger sister acting as our chaperone when we went to the Morelos Theater to see Pedro Infante movies. Her parents accepted me after several months of visiting them on Sunday afternoons, sitting in their living room, talking with her dad about soccer and politics, while her mom served us coffee with milk and sweet bread on porcelain plates they only used for important visitors. I asked her to marry me on Christmas Eve, 1999, in the courtyard of her house, while the whole family was eating tamales and punch. I had bought a white gold ring with a tiny diamond that cost me 3 months' salary, and I had been carrying it in my pocket for a week, waiting for the perfect moment. When I gave it to her, her eyes filled with tears, and she said yes before I could finish the question. We got married on July 15, 2000, at San Francisco Parish, the same church where I had made my first communion. Tere wore a white dress that her mother had been paying for in installments for 6 months, with a veil that had belonged to her grandmother, and a bouquet of white roses that we cut from my Aunt Esperanza's garden on the morning of the wedding. The ceremony was simple but beautiful. Father Martinez, who had baptized me 18 years earlier, married us with a mass sung by the church choir. When we exchanged rings, my hands were shaking so much that I almost dropped Tere's ring. During the kiss, I heard the applause of our families and felt my heart was going to burst out of my chest with happiness. The party was in the courtyard of my parents' house, with long tables made of planks on trestles, white paper tablecloths, and a mariachi band that the two families hired. We ate mole, red rice, charro beans, and a 3-tiered cake that Tere's godmother, who was a professional baker, had made. We danced until 3 in the morning. And when the last guests left, Tere and I went to our first home. 2 rooms we had rented in Doña Carmen's house, furnished with the little we had been able to buy and our wedding gifts. Our first home was small, but it was ours. 2 rooms, a bathroom shared with the other tenants, and a kitchen that was really more like a kitchenette with a 2-burner stove and a small sink that barely fit the dishes. But to us, it was a palace. Tere had sewn floral curtains for the windows, I had painted the walls peach, and we had put the furniture we had been given at the wedding in the living room. A brown 2-seater sofa, a pressed wood coffee table, and a 14-inch television we had bought used. The first months of marriage were like a never-ending honeymoon. Tere had found a job as a receptionist at a dental office downtown, and I was still working at Don Miguel's store, but now with a raise that brought my pay to 40 pesos a week. Between the 2 of us, we made enough to pay the rent, buy food, and even save a little for the future. In the mornings, Tere would get up at 6 to make me breakfast before I left for my part-time job at the mechanics shop I had opened with my cousin Roberto. Huevos rancheros, refried beans, warm tortillas, and coffee sweetened with piloncillo. We ate together at our small table, talking about our plans, the things we wanted to buy for the house, the places we wanted to visit someday. Diego was born on March 12, 2001, after a pregnancy that filled our little home with excitement and nerves. Tere had suffered terrible nausea during the first 3 months, and I had become an expert at making her chamomile tea with lemon and massaging her swollen feet when I got home from work. We had turned half of our bedroom into a nursery, with a wooden crib that my father had made. Walls painted yellow because we didn't know if it would be a boy or a girl, and a mobile with stuffed animals that Tere had sewn with her own hands. The day Diego was born was the longest and most beautiful day of my life. Tere started having contractions at 5 in the morning, and by 8 we were at the health center, where Dr. Ramirez told us we still had several hours to go. I stayed in the waiting room, pacing back and forth, drinking watered-down coffee from the machine, listening to Tere's screams from the delivery room, and feeling completely useless. Diego was born at 6 in the afternoon, weighing 3 kilos 200 grams, with a head full of black hair and lungs that announced his arrival to the world, with cries that could be heard throughout the hospital. When the nurse placed him in my arms, wrapped in a yellow blanket, I felt something I had never felt before. He was mine. He was part of me and part of Tere, but he was also completely his own. His eyes were closed, his little hands were perfect, and when he opened his mouth to cry, I saw that he had the same corners of his mouth as me. The first few months with Diego were a mixture of absolute happiness and total exhaustion. He woke up every 2 hours to eat, and Tere and I took turns taking care of him. I learned how to change diapers, warm up his bottle to the right temperature, and hold him in a certain way so he would fall asleep. The early mornings became our special time. Diego crying, Tere breastfeeding him in the rocking chair we had bought secondhand, and me sitting on the bed, watching my little family and feeling like the luckiest man in the world. Sophia arrived 2 years later, on November 8, 2003. Her pregnancy was easier than Diego's, but the delivery was more complicated. Tere had to stay in the hospital for 3 extra days because Sophia was born with jaundice, And during those days, I was left alone with Diego, who was already walking and talking and didn't understand why his mother wasn't home. I vividly remember those nights, sleeping on the couch with Diego curled up on my chest, waking up every hour to make sure he was still breathing. Sofia was different from Diego from the beginning. Where Diego had been a quiet baby, Sofia was pure energy. She cried louder, moved more, and once she learned to crawl, there was no way to keep her still. But she was also more affectionate, more cheerful, and she had this way of looking at me with her big, dark eyes that completely melted me. With 2 children, our small house felt even smaller. Toys were everywhere. The walls had crayon marks at little hand height, and silence had become a luxury we only experienced when both of them were asleep at the same time. But it was beautiful chaos, full of laughter, first words, first steps. Those little moments that now, from this distance, I understand were the most important of my life. Everything started to change in 2005. The country's economy was bad, but in small towns like ours, crises always hit harder and lasted longer. The workshop I had with my cousin Roberto lost several customers because people no longer had money to repair their cars. They preferred to drive them until they broke down completely. Don Miguel had to fire me from the store because his sales had dropped by half. Suddenly, our small economic stability collapsed like a house of cards. I looked for work everywhere. I went to Morelia, to Uruapan, to every workshop, store, and factory I could find. Either there was no work, or they paid so little that I couldn't even afford the bus fare home. Diego was already 4 years old. Sofia was 2. And Tara had had to quit her job at the dentist's office because the dentist had gone to work in the United States and closed the clinic. The bills started piling up. First it was the rent, then the electricity, then the phone. Doña Carmen, our landlady, was understanding, but she had her own expenses. She gave us 2 months' grace, but after that we would have to find another place. The problem was that we didn't have enough money to move or to pay a deposit somewhere else. It was my cousin Roberto who first told me about the idea of going north. His older brother, Aurelio, had left for Los Angeles 3 years earlier and was working in construction. He sent money to his family every month, had bought a house in Morelia, and his children were attending private schools. It's not easy, Roberto told me, but it's the only way to get ahead. There's no future here anymore. At first, I rejected the idea completely. I couldn't abandon my family. I couldn't leave Terry alone with 2 small children. I couldn't go to a country where I didn't speak the language and didn't know anyone. But as the weeks went by and the situation worsened, the idea began to take shape in my head, like a storm cloud approaching slowly but inevitably. The last straw was when Diego got sick. He had a high fever that wouldn't go away. He was vomiting everything he ate, and he was so weak he couldn't even play. We took him to the health center, but the doctors said he needed tests that they couldn't do there, that we had to take him to a hospital in Morelia. The problem was that we didn't have the money to pay for those tests, or to stay in Morelia for as long as necessary. That night, while Diego slept restlessly with a fever, and Sofia cried because she sensed that something was wrong, I sat in the courtyard of our house and thought. The moon was full, just like the night I met Terry. But now its silvery light did not comfort me. Instead, it seemed to illuminate all our shortcomings, all our limitations. I realized that no matter how hard I worked, no matter how hard I tried, we would always be in the same situation, surviving from month to month, with no chance of giving my children something better. That's when I made the most difficult decision of my life. I told Terry that I was going to the United States, that I was going to work hard, that I was going to send money so she could take good care of the children, so we could buy our own house, so Diego and Sofia could study and have a better future. Terry cried all night. She told me that we were a family, that we had to stay together, that we had always managed to get by, and that we could do it again. But I had already made up my mind. In my head, it wasn't a selfish decision, but quite the opposite. It was a sacrifice I was making for my family. I was going to leave for a year or two, work like a dog, save every penny, and then come back with enough money to start over. It was a perfect plan, except for one thing I didn't consider. Time spent away is different from time spent at home, and people change in ways you can never predict. Preparations for the journey into the unknown. Once I made the decision, everything moved very quickly. My cousin Roberto connected me with his brother Aurelio, who gave me the phone number of a coyote he had known for years. His name was Don Pancho, and according to Aurelio, he was reliable and had gotten dozens of people across the border without any problems. The price was $2,000 per person. Money I obviously didn't have. But I could get it by selling everything we owned and borrowing the rest. First, we sold our furniture. The brown sofa where we had spent so many nights watching television, the coffee table where Diego had learned to draw, the television where we had watched Sofia cartoons on Sunday mornings. Everything went for a fraction of what we had paid for it. But we needed every penny. Terry packed our personal belongings into cardboard boxes we got at the market, and I took them to my parents' house, where she was going to stay with the kids while I was away. Then I sold my tools. Every wrench, every screwdriver, every hammer I had bought with so much effort over the years. It was like selling pieces of my identity, because those tools represented everything I knew how to do, everything I was. I sold them to other mechanics in town for much less than they were worth. But I needed the money fast. Even so, it wasn't enough. I had to borrow the rest from family and friends. My father lent me 500 pesos from his savings, money he had been saving for years for an emergency. My father-in-law lent me 300 more. Even though he wasn't convinced that leaving was a good idea. My uncles, my cousins, my compadres, everyone contributed what they could. In the end, I had the money, but I also had a debt that weighed heavily on my conscience. The 2 weeks before I left were the hardest of my life. Diego knew something was going on, but he didn't understand exactly what. He kept asking me when we were going back home, why we were living with his grandparents, why Mom was crying so much. Sofia was too young to understand, but she could feel the tension in the air and was more restless than usual. I tried to spend every free moment with my children. I took them to the park every day, bought them ice cream with the little money I had left, read them stories before bed, and played with them in my parents' backyard until nightfall. Every moment felt precious and fragile, as if it were the last, because in a sense it was. I didn't know when I would see them again, when I would be able to hold Sofia in my arms again, when I would be able to teach Diego something new. The night before I left, Terry and I stayed up all night talking. We went over the plan again and again. I was going to send her money every month. She was going to stay with my parents until we had enough to buy a house. The children were going to continue going to school, and I was going to come back in 2 years at the most. We made promises that we believed we could keep at the time, plans that sounded perfect in the safety of our room. But that reality would change. I promised her I would call her every week, that I would send her letters, that I would never forget a birthday or special day. She promised me she would wait for me, that she would take good care of the children, that she would keep me informed of everything that happened. We clung to each other that last night, as if we were shipwrecked sailors clinging to a life preserver. The morning of my departure came too quickly. I got up before dawn, showered quietly so as not to wake the children, put on my best clothes, and packed a small backpack with the few things I was taking with me. 2 changes of clothes, a photo of my family, the medal of the Virgin of Guadalupe that my mother had given me, and the little money I had left after paying the coyote. When the children woke up, I told them that Daddy was going away to work, but that he would be back soon. Diego hugged me tightly and asked me to bring him back a toy from where I was going. Sophia, who could barely speak, gave me a slobbery kiss on the cheek and said, "Bye-bye," in the English she had learned from watching cartoons. I didn't know that those would be the last words I would hear her say for a long time. The trip to the border was in an old bus that smelled of diesel and the sweat of nervous people. There were 12 men and 3 women, all with the same lost look in their eyes, all carrying the same weight of families left behind and uncertain dreams ahead. Don Pancho, the coyote, was a short, dark-skinned man with a gray mustache and calloused hands who spoke little and slept even less. He had made this trip hundreds of times, and his calmness contrasted with our nerves. During the 18-hour journey, I got to know my fellow travelers. There was Ramon, a 40-year-old man from Oaxaca who was leaving his sick wife and 4 children to find money for an operation. There was Julio, a boy of barely 18 from Guerrero, who was leaving because the drug traffickers had killed his older brother, and he was next on the list. There was Carmen, a 35-year-old woman from Chiapas, who had sold everything she owned to pay for the trip, and was looking for her sister, who had left 3 years earlier. Each one had a story of desperation, a compelling reason to risk everything on this journey. Listening to their stories, I realized that I wasn't the only one who had made this difficult decision, that there were thousands of people like me crossing the border every day, carrying the hopes of entire families on their backs. We arrived in Tijuana at dawn on the 2nd day. The city was waking up to the sounds of traffic, street vendors, and the chaotic energy of a border where 2 worlds collide. Don Pancho took us to a small house in a neighborhood near the border, where other coyotes coordinated crossings and dozens of migrants waited their turn to try to cross. The house smelled of overcooked beans, bodies that hadn't been washed in days, and the fear that can be smelled when many anxious people are crowded together in a small space. We slept on the floor, wrapped in blankets that had probably been used by hundreds of people before us. I didn't sleep a wink that night, listening to the whispered conversations of other migrants, the sirens of the border patrol in the distance, and the rapid beating of my own heart. The crossing was scheduled for 2 in the morning the next day. Don Pancho explained the route to us. We were going to walk through the desert for about 8 hours, avoiding the cameras and sensors of the migra, until we reached a point where another coyote would pick us up on the American side. He gave us bottles of water, granola bars, and warned us that whoever fell behind would be left behind forever. When the time came, we set off in single file toward the border. The night was cold and clear, with a waning moon providing enough light to see the path, but not enough to make us easily detectable. We crossed the wall through a tunnel that someone had dug under an abandoned house, a narrow, damp hole that smelled of wet earth and fear. On the American side, the desert stretched out endlessly under the stars. We walked in silence, following Don Pancho, who seemed to know every stone on the path. My new shoes, which I had bought especially for the trip, began to hurt after the first hour. By the 3rd hour, I had bleeding blisters on both feet. By the 5th hour, every step was agony. Around 5 in the morning, as the sky began to lighten on the horizon, we heard the sound of helicopters in the distance. Don Pancho made us lie down behind some thorny bushes and remain completely still. The helicopter flew over us 3 times, so close that I could see the faces of the agents peering out the windows with binoculars. My heart was beating so loudly that I thought they would hear it from the air. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the helicopter flew away. We kept walking, now faster, because Don Pancho knew that they had detected activity in the area and that ground patrols would soon arrive. My legs were shaking with exhaustion, my mouth was dry as a bone, and I was beginning to wonder if I had made the right decision. Finally, when the sun was high and the desert was starting to heat up like an oven, we saw the lights of a pickup truck in the distance. It was our contact on the American side, a second-generation Mexican-American who spoke Spanish with an accent, but knew all the ways to avoid the migra. We climbed into the back of the truck, crammed together like cattle, and for the next 2 hours we traveled hidden under a tarp as he drove us to Los Angeles. When we finally stopped and I was able to get out of the truck, I took a deep breath of Los Angeles air. It smelled different from the air in my town, heavier, with the smell of gasoline and fast food, but also with something indefinable that I later learned was the smell of opportunity. I was in the United States. I had made it across. Now the hardest part began, surviving and thriving in a completely new world. Los Angeles welcomed me with a noise I had never heard before, the constant sound of millions of people living their lives at the same time. It was April 2006, and the city felt like a giant organism that never slept, that never stopped moving, breathing, changing. Everything was bigger, faster, more complicated than I had imagined. My cousin Aurelio picked me up at the bus station where the coyote had left me. I hadn't seen him since before I got married, and he had changed a lot. He was heavier, darker from working under the sun, and he had a different way of walking, faster, more alert. He hugged me tight and said, "Welcome to the American dream, cousin. I hope you're ready to work like you've never worked in your life." He took me to his apartment in East LA, a small place he shared with 4 other Mexicans. It was an old 2-story building, painted a pale pink that was peeling in the sun, with small windows that looked out onto an alley where there was always music playing on a radio and children playing soccer with a deflated ball. The apartment had 2 bedrooms, a living room that doubled as a dining room, a kitchen the size of a closet, and a bathroom that everyone shared. My room was a corner of the living room with a mattress on the floor and a curtain hanging from a wire for some privacy. There I kept my backpack with my 2 changes of clothes, the photo of my family that I put in a shoebox that I used as a nightstand, and the medal of the Virgin Mary that I hung on a rusty nail in the wall. It was humble, but it was a roof over my head, and after nights in the desert, it felt like a luxury. That first night, I couldn't sleep. The noises of the city were constant. Sirens, cars passing by, music from the neighbors, shouting in languages I didn't understand. But more than the noise, what kept me awake was the reality of where I was. I had left everything I knew, everything I loved, to be lying on a stranger's mattress in a country where I didn't speak the language, where I didn't know the rules, where I was nobody. At 5 in the morning, Aurelio woke me up to go look for work. "There's no time to waste here," he said as he poured himself some watery coffee into a chipped mug. "Every day you don't work is money you don't send home." We got into his old pickup truck, a Ford that made strange noises but still ran, and drove to a Home Depot where dozens of Latino men were standing in the parking lot, hoping someone would hire them for a day's work. My first English lesson was practical and desperate. Contractors arrived in trucks, shouted what they needed in English, and workers ran up to them. I didn't understand anything, so I just followed Aurelio and tried to copy what he did. Construction, painting, moving were words I began to recognize out of sheer necessity. My first job was loading and unloading boxes from a moving truck. 8 hours under the California sun, carrying heavy furniture, appliances, boxes filled with someone else's life. The contractor was a fat American who chewed tobacco and spat into a Coca-Cola bottle. He didn't know my name. He just pointed at what I had to do and yelled faster when he thought I was going too slow. At the end of the day, he paid me $60 in cash, crumpled bills that smelled of sweat and hard work. It was more money than I had earned in a week in Mexico. But I had also worked harder than I had ever worked in my life. My hands were covered in blisters, my back ached as if I had been beaten, and my arms trembled with exhaustion. That night, after a dinner of refried beans and tortillas we had bought at a Latino grocery store, I sat in my corner and wrote my first letter to Terry. I told her about the trip, about Los Angeles, about my first day of work. I tried to sound optimistic, to make it all sound like an adventure. But as I wrote, the tears came out without me being able to control them. I missed her so much that it hurt physically, as if a part of my body had been torn away. The first few months were a constant struggle to survive. Every morning was the same routine. Get up at 5, grab a quick coffee, go to Home Depot or other places where I knew they hired day laborers, compete with dozens of other men desperate for work, and hope that someone would choose me. Some days I was lucky and got a job. Other days, I stood in the sun for hours, watching others get jobs while I went home empty-handed and with my pride wounded. The days without work were the worst, not only because of the money I didn't earn, but because they gave me time to think, to miss her, to doubt whether I had made the right decision. Little by little, I learned the unwritten rules of immigrant work in Los Angeles. I learned that some contractors paid well and treated you with respect, while others saw you as disposable labor. I learned that you had to arrive early, but not too early, because you looked desperate. I learned that it was better to work in small groups with people you knew, because that way you could watch each other's backs. I also learned English in the most practical way possible, out of absolute necessity. How much? What time? Where? Were my first phrases. I bought an English newspaper every day and tried to understand even one sentence. I watched English television in my apartment, listening to the same words over and over again until I began to understand their meaning. My big break came after 3 months of odd jobs. An American contractor named Mike, who had seen my work on several projects, offered me a steady job at his construction company. It was nothing fancy. Mason's assistant, carrying materials, mixing cement, cleaning construction sites. But it was steady work, 5 days a week, with a steady paycheck of $250 a week. Mike was different from other contractors. He was an older man, in his 50s, with gray hair and hands that showed a lifetime of physical labor. He had served in Vietnam, built houses all over California, and had a simple philosophy. Hard work deserves respect, no matter where you come from. He treated me like a human being, not a disposable tool. With a steady job, my life began to take shape. I moved into my own room in another apartment, nothing fancy, but it was mine. It was a small room in an apartment building near Pico Boulevard, with a window that looked out onto an alley where stray cats were always fighting over food. The room had a single bed, a small closet, and a desk where I kept a picture of my family and wrote letters every night. I established a routine that became sacred. Every Sunday morning, I would go to a payphone on First Street and call home. The calls were expensive, but they were my connection to everything that mattered. Hearing Tere's voice, Diego's laughter in the background, Sophia's babbling, gave me the strength to keep going all week. During those calls, Tere told me everything that was going on at home. Diego had started elementary school and was very smart, always the first to finish his homework. Sophia was already walking and talking, and she had my stubborn streak. My parents were doing well. My brothers were still struggling with their own financial problems. Everything was the same in the village, except that I wasn't there to experience it. At first, keeping in touch was easy. Letters arrived regularly, and phone calls were family events where everyone gathered around the phone. But little by little, without us realizing it, the distance began to take its toll. Letters became less frequent, calls shorter, conversations more forced. After a year working with Mike, I had learned enough basic English and had enough experience in construction to start taking on more responsibilities. Mike promoted me to assistant supervisor, which meant more money but also more responsibility. I was now earning $350 a week, and for the first time since I arrived, I began to feel like I was making progress. My English improved dramatically when I started working more closely with American supervisors. I learned technical vocabulary: drywall, plumbing, electrical, permits. But more importantly, I learned to communicate, to explain problems, to make suggestions. I discovered that I had a knack for languages, something I had never known because only Spanish was spoken in my town. With a better job came better living conditions. I moved into a one-bedroom apartment in a nicer neighborhood, close to downtown. I had my own kitchen, my own bathroom, and for the first time in a long time, something that felt like privacy. I bought a used TV, a table and chairs, and even plants for the windows. I was building a life, even if it was temporary. The money I sent to Mexico became more regular and more substantial. Every month, I sent $300 through Western Union, money that Tere used for household expenses, the children's school, and to save for our future home. In my letters, I described my plans: to work hard for 2 more years, save as much as possible, and return with enough money to buy a house and start my own business. But reality had other plans. With each passing month, I realized that life in the United States was more expensive than I had calculated. The apartment, food, clothes, transportation, everything cost more than expected. And there were unexpected expenses: medical emergencies, repairs to the used car I had bought, help for relatives who had also arrived and needed support. I also began to realize that my absence had an emotional cost that I hadn't considered. On phone calls, Diego started to sound different, more distant. He no longer told me the details of his day like he used to. He no longer asked me to tell him stories over the phone. Sophia, who had been very young when I left, was starting to talk more but didn't seem to remember who I really was. American culture began to influence me in ways I hadn't expected. I learned to value punctuality, efficiency, and direct communication. I started dressing differently, eating different foods, and thinking about time in a different way. The changes were subtle but constant, like a slow but relentless erosion of who I had been. On weekends, to combat loneliness, I started frequenting a Mexican bar in East LA where other immigrants gathered. There, I listened to music from my homeland, ate food that tasted like home, and spoke Spanish without having to translate my thoughts. It was like a temporary refuge from American reality, a place where I could be myself without adapting. At that bar, I met other men with stories similar to mine. There was Rodolfo from Oaxaca, who had left his wife and 5 children to work in restaurants. There was Gonzalo from Guerrero, who worked in landscaping and hadn't seen his family in 3 years. There was Mario from Michoacan, like me, who had come for 6 months and hadn't returned in 5 years. Listening to their stories, I began to understand a pattern that frightened me. They had all come with temporary plans. They had all promised to return soon, and they had all extended their stay indefinitely. "Just one more year," was the phrase we all repeated like a mantra. But it never came true. By the 3rd year of my stay in Los Angeles, the phone calls with my family had changed dramatically. What used to be long, detailed conversations had become short, functional exchanges. Terry would tell me the basics. The kids were fine, they had received the money. They needed something specific. I would tell her about work, how much I had sent, my ever-changing plans to return. Diego, now 8, had started speaking to me in English occasionally during our calls. At first, I was proud that he was learning the language I was working so hard to master. I saw it as an advantage for his future, a skill that would serve him well in life. I didn't understand then that it was the beginning of something more complicated. "Daddy," he would sometimes say instead of "Papa," and I would laugh and gently correct him. "Speak to me in Spanish, mijo. It's important that you don't forget our language." He would laugh and say, "Yes, Papa." But I could hear his Spanish starting to sound different, with little pauses as he searched for the right words. Sophia, who was already 5, was more difficult. She was so young when I left that she didn't really remember me. To her, I was a voice on the phone, an abstract presence who sent money and gifts in the mail. During our calls, she would often hide or refuse to talk to me. Terry had to convince her for several minutes before she would pick up the phone. The absences piled up like little tragedies. I missed Diego's first day of school, his first play, his first soccer game. I missed Sophia learning to ride a bike, her first day of kindergarten, her first Christmas recital. Each missed event was a little death, a piece of fatherhood I could never get back. Terry, for her part, had become a de facto single mother. She had to make all the decisions about the children, discipline them, comfort them when they were sad, celebrate with them when they had successes. I was like a remote consultant on raising my own children, giving opinions on situations I didn't fully understand because I wasn't living them. We started having our first serious fights over the phone. Terry complained that I didn't understand how hard it was to raise 2 children alone, that the money I sent wasn't worth my absence. I complained that she didn't appreciate all the sacrifices I was making, all the hard work I was doing to give them a better life. "The kids need their father," she would say in a tired voice, "not just his money." "I'm doing this for them," I would reply, frustrated. "Everything I do is for them, for you." "Don't you understand?" "What I understand is that Diego asks me why his dad doesn't come to his soccer games, and I don't know what to tell him." Those fights left me feeling guilty and defensive at the same time. I knew she was right about some things, but I also knew she was right about others. The distance was not only separating our bodies, but also our perspectives, our priorities, our realities. During my senior year, I noticed that Diego was starting to resist speaking Spanish with me. He wasn't openly rebellious, but I could sense his discomfort. His answers became shorter, his stories less detailed. When I asked him about school, he would answer in English, and I had to remind him to speak Spanish. "Why is it so important?" he asked me once, with that brutal logic of children. "Everyone here speaks English. At school, on TV, all my friends. Why do I have to speak differently?" I didn't know how to explain to him that Spanish wasn't just a language, but a connection to his history, to his culture, to me. For him, Spanish was becoming the language of home, of older people, of the past. English was the language of the future, of opportunities, of the real world. The moment that changed everything came during my 5th year in the United States, during one of our Sunday phone calls. Diego was 12 then, in middle school, and had begun to develop his own personality, his own opinions, his own identity. That personality, I discovered painfully, was forming in English. The conversation started normally. Terry told me about her week, the kids' grades, some extra expenses they'd had. Then she passed me to Diego, as she always did. But this time, when I started asking him about school in Spanish, he answered me in English. "Diego," I said, "we've already talked about this. Speak to me in Spanish." There was a long pause, and then I heard something in his voice I had never heard before. Irritation. "Dad, it's easier for me in English. I think in English now." "Son, it's important that we keep our language. Spanish is—" "I know it's important to you," he interrupted me, "but it's hard for me. When I speak Spanish, I sound different. My friends at school, they hear me speaking Spanish with Mom, and they think it's weird." I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. My son, my own son, was ashamed to speak the language I had taught him when he was little, the language I had sung lullabies to him in, the language of our roots. "Are you embarrassed to speak Spanish?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Another long pause. "Not embarrassed, exactly. It's just, Dad, when you call the school, when you talk to my teachers, your accent is really strong. And the other kids, they notice. They make comments." There it was. The raw, painful truth. My son was ashamed of me. Not of who I was, but of how I sounded. My accent, which to me was simply the way I spoke English, was to him a mark of difference, a sign that we didn't completely belong. "Son," I said, trying to control my voice, "I talk like this because English isn't my first language. But that's not a bad thing. It means I know 2 languages, that I know, Dad. I know you work hard and you learned English, and I'm proud of you. But it's different for me. I live here. This is my school, these are my friends. I don't want to be different." After hanging up the phone, I sat in my apartment for hours, processing what had happened. My son, the child I had carried in my arms, who had learned his first words from me, now felt that the way I spoke was something to be ashamed of. I realized that without meaning to, I had created an impossible situation. By coming to the United States to give them a better life, I had put my children in a position where they had to choose between 2 worlds. The world of their parents, with their accents and traditions, and the world where they lived, where perfect English was the ticket to acceptance. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake thinking about all the decisions I had made, all the sacrifices I had made, all the consequences I hadn't foreseen. I had come to the United States to give my family a better future. But in the process, I had lost something fundamental: the intimate connection with my own children. I got up and took out all the letters I had saved over the years, all the photos Terry had sent me in the mail. There was the evidence of everything I had missed. Diego at his first communion, wearing a suit I had paid for but never saw him wear. Sophia at her kindergarten graduation, smiling with teeth that had fallen out while I was thousands of miles away. Birthdays, Christmases, Father's Days, where I was just a distorted voice on the phone. But more painful than the physical absences was realizing that I had lost something more subtle, but more important: my moral and emotional authority as a father. My children had grown up without me, had formed their personalities without my daily influence, had learned to see the world through eyes that I had not helped shape. Diego was no longer the 4-year-old boy who had hugged me at the airport. He was an American teenager who thought in English, watched American television, had American friends, and lived in an American world. For him, Mexico was the place where he was born, but the United States was his home. And I, with my thick accent and small-town values, was increasingly a relic of a past he wanted to overcome. I began to understand that the problem wasn't just the language. The language was a symptom of something deeper: assimilation. My children were assimilating into American culture, which was exactly what I had wanted when I decided they should have a better life. But assimilation came at a price: distance from their roots, from their original culture, from me. I realized that I had made the mistake of thinking that the money I sent could make up for my absence. I had assumed that my financial sacrifice would automatically translate into gratitude and respect from my children. But children don't understand financial sacrifice. They understand presence, being there when they need you, being part of their daily lives. Over the next few weeks, I tried to change the dynamic of our phone conversations. Instead of speaking only Spanish and insisting that they do the same, I started speaking English as well. My English had improved a lot over the years, although I still had a strong accent. I thought that if I spoke their language, maybe we could connect better. But it was worse. When I spoke English, I could hear Diego relax, feel more comfortable. But I felt like I was betraying something fundamental about who I was. English, no matter how well I had learned it, was still a borrowed language for me. In English, I couldn't express the emotional nuances I wanted to convey. I couldn't be completely myself. By my 6th year in Los Angeles, I had achieved a certain financial stability. I was making good money, had a decent apartment, had bought a used but reliable car, and had even started saving money in earnest. According to my original plans, I should have already returned to Mexico with enough money to buy a house and start a business. But the reality was more complicated. I had discovered that enough money was a moving target. Every time I thought I had saved enough, something new came up. A medical emergency for my parents, problems with the house where my family lived in Mexico, the need to buy more expensive school uniforms for Diego, who was now in a better school. There was always a reason to stay another year, to save a little more. But more complicated than the finances was the fact that I myself had changed. 6 years in the United States had transformed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I was no longer the same Carlos who had left La Piedad. I had learned to navigate a completely different system, developed skills I didn't know I had, and seen possibilities I had never imagined. In Mexico, I had been a small-town mechanic with limited horizons. In the United States, I had discovered that I was capable of learning English, supervising work teams, understanding complex systems, and adapting to situations that would have seemed impossible before. It wasn't that I felt superior to who I had been before, but that I had discovered parts of myself that would never have emerged if I had stayed in my hometown. But this personal evolution came with a painful consequence. I felt increasingly disconnected from the life I had left behind in Mexico. When I talked to Terry, our conversations felt forced, as if we were speaking from two different worlds. She told me about problems and situations that seemed small compared to the challenges I faced daily in Los Angeles. I told her about my work and my life, but I could sense that she didn't really understand the world I now lived in. The biggest problem was that my children were growing up without really knowing who I was now. To them, I was still the dad who had left when they were little, frozen in time in their memories. They didn't know the Carlos who had learned to drive on 6-lane highways, who had learned to use basic computers for work, who had developed the confidence to talk to American supervisors, who had learned to navigate complicated bureaucracies. Diego was 14 now, in high school, and when we talked on the phone, I could sense that he saw me as a relic from the past. His interests were completely American. Sports teams I didn't know, music I had never heard, cultural references that were completely foreign to me. I tried to participate in his conversations, but it was obvious that I didn't really understand his world. Sophia, now 11, was even more distant. To her, I was practically a stranger who called on the phone and sent money. She had grown up her entire life without my daily presence. And although Terry and my parents told her about me, I was not a tangible reality in her everyday life. The cruel irony of my situation became clear to me during a particularly difficult conversation with Diego. He was telling me about a school project where he had to write about his cultural heritage. He told me he had decided to write about being Mexican-American, but that he felt confused because he didn't really feel Mexican or completely American. "Dad," he said, "I was born in Mexico, but I don't really remember it. I speak Spanish, but not as well as English. I eat Mexican food, but I also love hamburgers. I don't know what I am exactly." His identity crisis mirrored my own. I didn't know exactly what I was anymore either. Was I Mexican? Yes, I was born in Mexico, my heart was in Mexico, my roots were in Mexico. But I had lived in the United States for 6 years. I had adopted American customs. I thought in English at work. I had developed perspectives that were more American than Mexican in many ways. Was I American? Not really. I didn't have papers. I didn't have the rights of a citizen. I always lived with the fear of being deported. But I had contributed to the American economy. I had paid taxes. I had followed the laws. I had built a life here. He was something in between, something that didn't have an exact name. An Americanized Mexican living in legal and emotional limbo, belonging completely to nowhere, but partially to both places. The turning point came during a phone call in the fall of my 7th year in the United States. Diego was 15 and had started working part-time at a fast food restaurant to earn his own money. He was smart, responsible, and, according to Terry, very mature for his age. Too mature, I thought. He had had to grow up fast without a father around. The conversation began like many others, with Terry updating me on the children's activities and household expenses. Then she passed me to Diego, who told me about school, his job, and his plans for the future. Everything was normal until he mentioned that he had had a meeting with his school counselor about college plans. "The counselor says I have good grades, and I could probably get into a good college," he told me in English, as he had begun to do more often. But she also said that it would be easier if I had better documentation of my status. My heart stopped. "What do you mean by documentation?" Well, Dad, I was born in Mexico, but I've lived here most of my life. The counselor was asking about my immigration status, about whether I'm a citizen or resident or what. And I realized I don't really know what I am legally. There was the problem I had been avoiding thinking about for years. Diego had grown up as an American, thought like an American, had American aspirations. But legally, he was still Mexican. And I, his father, was in the United States illegally, unable to give him the legal stability he needed to fulfill his American dreams. "Son," I said, trying to sound calm, "it's complicated. But we're going to figure it out. Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Tell me, are you planning to come back to Mexico? Ever? Because I've been thinking, and I don't think I want to go back to Mexico. This is my home. My friends are here. My school is here. My life is here. I barely remember Mexico." His words hit me like a slap in the face. My son, for whom I had sacrificed everything, for whom I had left everything I loved, no longer wanted to return to the place where he was born. For him, Mexico was not home. It was the place where his parents were born, but not his real home. "Diego," I said, my voice breaking, "I came here to give you a better life, to give you opportunities. And I'm grateful, Dad. Really, I am. But I need to know. If I want to stay here, if I want to go to college here, if I want to build my life here, will you support me? Even if it means that we stay separated?" I didn't know how to respond. How could I tell my son that I wouldn't support his dreams? But how could I accept that my sacrifice had resulted in the permanent loss of my family? "Dad," Diego continued, now switching to Spanish as if he had noticed my pain, "I know you work very hard for us, and I respect that. But I need you to understand that my life is here now. Sophia's too. She doesn't even remember Mexico. For us, the United States is our country." After hanging up, I sat in my apartment in total silence. Outside, Los Angeles continued with its constant noise. But inside my head, there was a deafening silence. I realized that I had lost my children in a way I had never imagined. I had lost them not through death or divorce, but through success. My plan had worked too well. I had given them a better life. But that better life didn't include me. That night, I made a decision I had been avoiding for years. I was going back to Mexico for Christmas. It was 2012. I had been away for almost 7 years, and I needed to see my family face to face. I needed to understand who my children were now, and I needed them to understand who I was. The trip back was surreal. Crossing the border to the south, seeing the familiar landscapes of my country, hearing Spanish everywhere, smelling real Mexican food. It all filled me with such intense nostalgia that it physically hurt. But I also realized that I felt like a tourist in my own country. I had changed so much that Mexico felt familiar, but also strange. When I arrived in La Piedad, Diego was 15 and Sofia was 12. I hadn't seen them in person since Diego was 4 and Sofia was a baby. Physically, they had obviously changed completely. But more striking than the physical changes were the changes in their personalities, in the way they spoke, in their cultural references. Diego was tall and thin, with my same gait, but with a confidence I had never had at his age. He spoke Spanish perfectly, but with small inflections and expressions that were clearly American. Sofia was beautiful, with her mother's intelligent eyes and a lively personality that filled any room she was in. But she also spoke Spanish with small pauses, searching for words she knew in English, but not in Spanish. The first few days were awkward. They treated me with respect, but also with a formality that hurt me. It was clear that they saw me as the dad who sent money, not the dad who had been present in their daily lives. I tried to connect with them, but our cultural references were completely different. It was during the third night of my visit that we had our first real, honest conversation. We were having dinner at my parents' house, all together for the first time in years, when Diego asked me a direct question. "Dad, why didn't you ever come back? You always said you'd be back in a year or two, but you never came back." The question put me in a difficult position because the honest answer was complicated. "Son, I always wanted to come back. But things in the United States, it's different than I thought. It's harder to save money, and there were always new expenses. But also," Sophia interrupted, surprising me by speaking in English, "you changed, didn't you? You're different now." She was right. I had changed, and part of me didn't want to go back to the life I had before. In the United States, I had discovered possibilities that didn't exist in my town. It wasn't just about money, but about who I could be, what I could achieve. "Yes," I admitted, "I've changed. But you've changed too. And that's okay. People grow, they evolve." "Dad," Diego said, instinctively switching to English when he wanted to express something important, "I want you to know that I understand why you left. And I'm grateful. Because of your sacrifice, I have opportunities that I wouldn't have had if we had stayed poor in Mexico. But I also want you to understand that we've built a life without you. Not because we wanted to, but because we had to." That conversation was the beginning of a new understanding between us. During the rest of my visit, we talked openly about our experiences during these years apart. Diego told me about how he had had to translate for Tere in official situations, how he had had to take on responsibilities that would normally fall to a father. Sophia told me about how she had made up stories about me to tell her friends, because it was easier than explaining the real situation. Terry and I also had long, difficult conversations. She had changed too. She was no longer the shy girl I had met at the dance. She was a strong, independent woman who had raised 2 children on her own, who had made difficult decisions, who had built a life without me. She still loved me, but she didn't need me in the same way anymore. The moment of truth. My visit to Mexico lasted a month, and at the end of that month, I had to make a decision I had been avoiding for years. Did I stay in Mexico or return to the United States? Logically, I should have stayed. I had saved enough money to buy a modest house. I had achieved my original goal, and my family was here. But during that month, I also realized that I no longer fit completely in Mexico. My outlook had changed. My expectations were different. My skills were geared toward a different job market. In my town, I was still Carlos the mechanic who had gone north. They didn't see the Carlos who had learned English, who had supervised teams, who had developed confidence and new skills. More importantly, I realized that my children had their own lives now. Diego was in high school, had plans to go to college, had friends and activities that were important to him. Sophia was developing her own personality and interests. My presence after so many years was welcome, but it wasn't essential to their daily lives. They had learned to live without me. The hardest decision of my life turned out to be returning to the United States. Not because I didn't love my family, but because I realized that my role as a father had evolved. I was no longer the present father who made daily decisions. I was the father who supported from a distance, who provided financial stability, who was available for advice and emotional support when needed. When I told my children that I was going back to Los Angeles, I saw relief in their eyes, along with sadness. I think they had been worried that my return would disrupt the stability they had built during my absence. My decision to return to the United States confirmed to them that I understood and respected the lives they had built. Diego said something to me that last day that I will never forget. "Dad, I want you to know that I'm proud of you. Not just because you work hard or because you send money, but because you learn to live in a completely different world. That takes courage. And even though we don't live together, you're still my dad, and that will never change." Living with the consequences. I returned to Los Angeles with a completely different perspective on my life and my decisions. I was no longer living in limbo, waiting for the moment to return to Mexico. I had accepted that my life was in the United States, at least for the foreseeable future. That acceptance freed me to start building a more complete life here. I moved into a better apartment, started making American friends in addition to Latino friends, and enrolled in more advanced English classes at the local community college. For the first time in years, I began to think of the United States not as a temporary place where I was working, but as my home. But the story that hurts me the most, the one that brought me to write all this, happened exactly 1 week ago. Diego called me to tell me about the parent-teacher conference at his school. He's 17 now, a senior in high school, and applying to colleges. "Dad," he said, "my English teacher wants to meet you because I wrote an essay about immigration for my college applications. She thinks it's really good and wants to talk to you about my experience." I was filled with pride. My son had written about our experience, about the sacrifice of separation, about the complexities of being the child of immigrants. "Sure, son. Whenever you want." "Well, here's the thing," he continued, and I could hear the awkwardness in his voice. "Would it be okay if you tried to... I don't know how to say this without sounding mean. Tell me, Diego. You can tell me anything. Could you try to speak more slowly, more clearly? Your accent is really strong, Dad, and sometimes it's hard for people here to understand you. I don't want the teacher to think... I want her to see how smart you are. But sometimes your English..." There it was again. After all these years, after everything I had learned and accomplished, my son still felt he had to apologize for how I sounded. And the worst part was that I understood exactly why he felt that way. "Diego," I said, "I understand what you're asking me to do. And I'll do my best to speak clearly. But I also want you to understand something. My accent is part of who I am. It's proof that I learned a second language as an adult, that I had the courage to adapt to a new world. It's not something I need to be ashamed of." "I know, Dad. I know. And I'm not ashamed of you. Really. It's complicated. I want people to see you the way I see you, and sometimes the language barrier makes that harder." After that conversation, I realized that I had reached a point of total acceptance. My son wasn't ashamed of me as a person, but he did feel uncomfortable with the obvious signs of my foreign origins. And that was okay. It was part of the price of immigration, part of the reality of raising children in a culture different from your own. The wisdom of distance. Now, as I write this story in my apartment in Los Angeles, I see my experience with a clarity I didn't have before. I've been in the United States for 18 years. Diego is 17, about to graduate from high school, and has been accepted to several universities. Sophia is 14, a smart and confident teenager who speaks better English than Spanish, although she understands both perfectly. My relationship with my children has evolved into something I never expected, but that works for our reality. I am not the traditional father who lives in the same house and makes daily decisions. I am more like a distant mentor, an emotional and financial provider, a cultural reference point. We talk regularly on the phone, visit when possible, and maintain a connection that is different but real. Diego no longer apologizes as much for my accent, although I can still sense his occasional discomfort. He has matured enough to understand that my language limitations do not reflect my intellectual limitations or my value as a person. Sophia, for her part, has developed a relationship with me that is completely unique. She sees me as a special character in her life, not exactly as a traditional father, but as something important and unique. Tere and I have found a way to maintain our marriage across the distance. It's not what we would have chosen, but it works. She manages daily life in Mexico. I manage financial stability from the United States. And together, we have raised two extraordinary children who are bicultural, bilingual, and able to navigate worlds that none of us knew when we were young. The irony of my story is that I achieved exactly what I set out to do when I decided to come to the United States. To give my children opportunities they would not have had in Mexico. Diego is going to college, something that would have been financially impossible if we had stayed in my hometown. Sophia has academic and professional aspirations that transcend anything I could have imagined for a girl from my hometown. But the cost of that success was exactly what I didn't anticipate. The cultural distance between my children and me. They are Mexican Americans in a way that I can never be. They are completely comfortable in both worlds, while I will always be primarily Mexican, living in the United States. Reflections for other immigrants. If there are other immigrant parents reading this, I want you to know that I am not trying to discourage anyone from seeking a better life for their families. What I did was the right decision given the circumstances. My children have opportunities they never would have had, and for that, I have no regrets. But I also want them to understand the real costs of immigration, especially when it involves family separation. Children who grow up in the United States without their parents develop a complex relationship with their cultural heritage. They don't reject their culture of origin, but they don't embrace it in the way their parents expect. It's important to understand that children who grow up in the United States will speak English as their dominant language, think like Americans in many ways, and develop perspectives that are different from their parents. This isn't betrayal, it's adaptation. It's exactly what we as parents want to happen. But when it does, it can be painful. My advice to other parents in similar situations is, stay connected, but don't insist that your children remain the same as they were when you left. Allow them to grow, evolve, and become citizens of the world. Your role as a parent doesn't disappear, but it does change. And more importantly, don't take it personally if your children adapt better to the new country than you do. That adaptation is evidence that your sacrifice worked, not that it failed. Today, Diego is in his last semester of high school. He has been accepted to 3 universities, including one that offers a special program for first-generation students. Studying abroad is one of the many options he is considering.